Hi, my name is Derek Sebastian, and I'm with Bayer Range and Pasture out of Greeley, Colorado. Before that, I had the opportunity to work at CSU and do grad school with Dr. Scott Nissen. Had the opportunity to work on some really exciting projects all around invasive annual grasses, new tools, technologies to manage those, and I'm going to talk today about how that relates to wildfire risk management because, like we know, wildfires are devastating the western U.S. right now, and we see that right in our backyard. So how can we help decrease that risk of wildfire? So that's really what I'm going to talk about. I did want to thank Jonathan Reif for the opportunity to present to you all today for your wildfire prevention workshop. And I wish I could be there in person, but hopefully you'll take away some informative information that can help you guys make some more informed decisions on wildfire risk management. So I'm going to talk mostly surrounding invasive annual grasses, as you'll see kind of interweave throughout my presentation. So let's go ahead and get right into it. In terms of the agenda, I'm going to talk a lot about how we manage invasive weeds and how that ties into seed bank management. Why is it important to manage seed bank management? But then also, what can we do to decrease the risk of wildfires? And a large part of that is not only eliminating weeds, but the fine fuels that are associated with those species. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the benefits of fine fuel management. So if you haven't heard of fine fuels, we'll talk about that in quite a bit of detail. The past few years in 2020, we had some very severe wildfires, the Cameron Peak, the Calwood wildfires, and we had the opportunity to do some case studies in those areas where we had previous treatments before the wildfire, so fine fuel treatments before, and we were able to see how that influenced some of the wildfire behavior. So I think you guys will really enjoy some of that information. And then I'm going to talk about a new tool called Range View, because you guys information is very important and vital to making the best decisions on the landscape. So whether you're a rancher, land manager, if there's any piece of land that you're interested in managing and decreasing that wildfire risk, you really need to know where are our hot spots, where are the hot spots for the weeds, the fine fuel. And there's a tool now called Range View that I'm going to talk about that can help you do that using satellite imagery right from your computer. So I'll talk about that at the very end here. So let's go ahead and get right into it. I'm going to talk kind of high level to begin. Invasive annual grasses. It's something that I'm kind of near and dear to my heart. It's something I've been involved highly with. And invasive grasses, they're so prolific. They're such cross-boundary issue that it's something that I think relates to just about everybody in here. And in terms of wildfires, has one of the biggest impacts on wildfire intensity and frequency in the West. So when you talk about invasive winter annual grasses, if you haven't heard of these types of species, they are very prolific. They're annual species that reproduce primarily by seed. And what happens is they can germinate in the fall and winter. So that's why they're called winter annual grasses. And what they do is they exploit the moisture and nutrients of the system of the perennial desirable species, whether that's perennial grasses, forbs, shrubs, trees, and while they're dormant in the winter, these invasive winter annual grasses are like parasites. They suck the life out of the system. They take out the moisture and the nutrients from all the perennials, the desirables that we have in these sites. And what we see is that they dry out very early in the summer, right? Because they've been growing all winter. They dry out very early. And so they're the color that you see in these photos. They're this brown, highly flammable, fine fuel that continues to add fuel year after year. And when we're in the peak fire season, they are this brown, highly flammable growth stage. And that's why I wanted to focus mostly on these invasive winter annual grasses, because they are such a risk due to that high flammability of the fine fuel that they do produce. And they're prolific seed producers. So I'm going to talk a lot about, we need to manage the fuel, the fine fuel of these species, but how do we do that? How do we actually get rid of these species and promote the desirable perennials so we don't have that fire risk in these locations? So I had the opportunity to do quite a few projects in that realm with a lot of different collaborators, and we'll talk about some of those projects as we go. When you look at the invasive winter annual grass, I call it the most wanted list. What you're probably most familiar with is cheatgrass and Japanese brome. You've probably heard of jointed goat grass. That's another one that you could see in your areas. There's other ones also that are starting to move our direction from the Pacific Northwest called Ventonata and Medusa Head. They actually found these two a few years ago in Wyoming, in Utah. So we're actually surrounded by these, and they're moving from the Pacific Northwest into the Great Plains ecoregion, which is where Colorado is. And the difficulty with these species is they're still highly flammable. They actually have been found to actually outcompete cheatgrass even. So they're very, very competitive species. So when you look at invasive winter annuals, it's oftentimes not just one species, even though cheatgrass and Japanese brome are the most prolific, but there are a few other ones out there as well that all have the characteristics of, winter annual, parasitic, have this fine fuel accumulation that builds up over time and is a huge wildfire risk. This is really a standard type photo. I took this on the way back from a trip from Casper, Wyoming, just on the side of the road. And, you see this typical, right? It's an invasive annual. Like I said, it's parasitic to those perennial grasses that you see in this photo. Those perennials are just able to barely hold on because cheatgrass is in that system all the winter, all through the winter, all the spring, while those perennials are dormant. Sucks the life out of that system before the perennials are even awake in the spring. And then what happens is it just keeps, this cycle until you get wildfires that you can see during this June, July, August timeframe when wildfires are such an issue. That's when these invasive annual grasses have this senesce brown, highly flammable characteristic. And this is really what the system and what we're seeing all throughout the West is happening. And it's one of those things where it is very urgent because we see these wildfires that just are becoming more and more prolific in the West. And what we had in the past was these areas that had these on the top left, these highly diverse perennial ecosystems that look at stay green, just like this photo, well into June, well into July, and we have these healthy, deep-rooted systems. But unfortunately, we have these parasitic grasses that come in, like you see on that top right photo. And what they do is they just come in, they continue, or they start to suck the life out, use that moisture from the shrubs, the grasses. And what it is it acts as a carpet. So when we talk about fine fuel, once those annuals grow through the season, they dry out and senesce, that falls and builds up on the soil surface. So that can build a thatch layer of multiple inches of this fine fuel. And what happens is it connects all those perennial plants. So a healthy system actually has bare ground between plants. And so that wildfire, when it starts in a natural system, it burns in more of a mosaic pattern. But when you have invasive annual grasses, it burns the site completely and entirely, where you see a photo like that on the bottom right, where you have all the interconnecting characteristics of cheatgrass between all of your desirables, which then burns out the root crowns of a lot of these species, such as these shrubs, which are, they're not fire adapted. They're used to fires, a fire regime of around every 40 years, but we're seeing wildfires now every, 2, 3, 5 years, and these perennials just can't withstand that. And so then you end up with a system like you see on that bottom left corner in Nevada, where you have absolutely no perennials. If you treated those areas, some of those, they just would not respond. There would be no perennials to come back. So what we need to do is really prioritize our sites, because we want to avoid those monocultures of cheatgrass that continue to build, because that's really the trend that we're on right now if we don't be proactive. What we also know is if we lose all those perennials, it is extremely difficult to get those perennials back. And this is a picture showing, a drill seeding stand. And in a lot of cases, it can be hundreds, if not thousands of dollars to do a seeding project, because a lot of times they fail the first time because of moisture issues. So you have to seed a second, maybe a third time, and then you don't get the diversity that you once had. So you have these monotypic stands. If you do get something established, you're never going to get back what you once had. So it's very important that we prioritize sites that we can still save now and before they're completely displaced by these invasive winter annuals and that cycle that is very difficult to break the longer that you wait. So what is the key? And what we're finding is catching your site early in the degradation process, like I mentioned, is so critical. This is a lot of the photos you'll see today are from along the Colorado Front Range. And luckily for us, we have very diverse systems in a lot of cases, and we still have, unless there's been 2 or 3 or 4 fires that have been pretty recent on one site, a lot of these sites still have a lot left in terms of perennials. They're just being highly suppressed, just like this photo shows. If you can get rid of the cheatgrass, like the right-hand photo shows, if you can treat that cheatgrass and get rid of it for the long term, those perennials are still intact. Nothing needs to be reseeded unless it's been highly, highly degraded. And those highly seeded, highly degraded areas we want to save for later. Those are already very difficult to recover. So we want to save those sites that are kind of in that transition zone. And I wanted to show you this picture. This is from the Wyoming Game and Fish Department. Western Governors Association helped put this together as well. But I think it really shows this idea pretty well, where you have these highly degraded sites where that ambulance is on the left-hand side, and those are the sites that have burned multiple times per year, right? Or every 10 years, every 5 years. And it's more of this reactive, a fire happened and then we have to come in and we do a treatment or maybe a seeding, but it can be extremely expensive, like I said, hundreds if not thousands of dollars per acre. And the chances of success, especially in our arid West, is very difficult to get reestablishment of those perennials once they're lost. So the other side of the coin is these intact core areas, and that's really where we need to focus. And this is that more preventative care, proactive. It's less expensive. We have more likelihood of success, especially in these transition zones, because that's where we have the chance of saving those sites. Really, it's tipping the balance right now of, if we wait too long, if we continue to get these wildfires, they're going to be in that ambulance emergency care zone. But fortunately for us on the Colorado Front Range, we haven't had as many of those continual wildfires. There's starting to be more of them, but we're still in this opportunity to have this transition zone and restore these areas that still have the intact perennials. And that's what a lot of the talk today is going to focus on, is just prioritizing sites while we still have the chance. This is a photo I wanted to share that just kind of shows what this looks like on a landscape. This is an area in along the Colorado Front Range, kind of Boulder County, I believe, that shows you this is a shrub ecosystem that has completely been overrun with invasive annual grasses. The shrub leaders are starting to club because there's less moisture for these shrubs to grow from year to year. They're getting hammered by the wildlife because there's less food for the wildlife now that the invasive annual grasses are continuing to devastate these areas. So this just shows the concern in these areas that where they're multi-use sites. You may have cattle, you may have wildlife, you may be concerned about the pollinators and different things, and they're all impacted by these invasive annual grasses. I like to show this, I guess, figure because it kind of shows you in terms of the web of life in the West, and what they're finding is that cheatgrass is one of the largest threats to mule deer populations in the entire West. And it's a huge threat to other animals as well, because you can see that in this image, the web of life, you can see that the shrubs, the perennials are really the lifeblood of a lot of these systems, in terms of the sage grouse, the pronghorn, the mule deer, the elk. And so it's something that if we don't preserve these intact perennial systems, then we're going to lose a lot more than just the plant species. We're going to see this impacting the wildlife, the pollinators, the cattle production, and things like that. So I just want to show that in terms of kind of big picture. It's not just about losing plant communities and things like that. It has much more repercussions than maybe a lot of people really think. When you talk about cattle production, this is what I also find really interesting, is that there's a huge cumulative effect of reduced forage quality in an area too, because even though you may have good perennial grass kind of intertwined within an area that has cheatgrass, like that photo shows, you can see that there's some good grass in there. There may be 300-400 pounds per acre of good grass, but the cheatgrass, it browns out. The cattle can't go in there like tweezers. They don't graze like tweezers. They can't get in there and utilize a lot of those perennials within that system, which means that you're losing equity in those areas of those pastures where you have the cheatgrass. And the other thing is that when you have areas like this where they can't get in and tweeze away, they're going to overgraze areas that you don't have the cheatgrass. So it's just this kind of full circle, where if you have cheatgrass in a system, they're going to overgraze areas, and it's just going to continue the spread of the undesirable invasive grasses in time. And then what this also means is the nutrients, the quality of the forage for cattle is a lot less as well. So these cattle are actually going to have to consume about 10 pounds of forage more per day, because they're not getting the quality, because they're having to, if they do, they can tweeze through some of it, but it's very difficult for them to meet their needs, which means in a 30-day grazing period, they need to take another 300 pounds of forage per head per month, which means that it's even more stress on that pasture that you have, let alone the fire risks and all the other things that we talked about. So this is just in terms of cattle production. If you're interested in that information, I could do a whole talk on that as well, but today we're going to focus on wildfire. So I just wanted to touch on that real quick. All right, so how do we manage these invasive annual grasses? We talked about all the impacts they have, but how do we actually get ahead of the game and reduce the invasive grasses, which means we're going to reduce the risk of wildfire? What we know is that invasive annual grasses are annuals, right? So they have the reproduced seed every single year. They deposit that into the soil, which is what I call the soil seed bank, right? And what happens is some of those seeds germinate every year and some of them do not. And what happens is over time, this cycle continues until that seed bank continues to grow over time. And that seed bank is really what we like to call the 401k of that plant, right? Because it's long-term security. If that plant is going to make it through the next year and the next year, it has to continue to add to this seed bank over time. So what do you guys think is the one way that we can get rid of these plants for the long term? It's to really deplete that soil seed bank jar. And that's the only way we can get ahead of the game, is getting to the point of seed bank depletion. But for every species has a different seed bank life. So I'll talk about how long do we have to manage cheatgrass to get rid of it to then impact the wildfire reduction piece. So what we did is some work at CSU where we managed using glyphosate as our means of control for cheatgrass in the spring. And we did basically 1 year of control all the way up to 5 consecutive years to see, okay, what is the sweet spot with cheatgrass? How many years do we actually have to manage the species to get rid of it? How many consecutive years? And so this photo or this image is going to show you kind of what basically an overall review of that study. And what we found is that when we did 1 year of control, so 2011, we reduced that cheatgrass greatly, but within one single year, what came back? That seed bank jar was not depleted because we didn't use anything with any residual control. That seed bank just came right back. The cheatgrass came right back within one single year. When we did 2 years of control, which this shows, we got 2011, 2012, so 2 years of control, you would think we'd get some depletion of the seed bank, but there's so much still left in the seed bank that by 1, 2, 3 years, we're back to where we started. There was no control by that 2015 period, right? It's like we did nothing. If we did 3 years of control, we saw the reduction for 3 years, 2011, 12, and 13, but it reverted right back within 2 years, just 2 years, and you're back to the, the start. It's like you did nothing. So what level of investment is it worth, right? If you're going to just do 1 year of management, it's just going to come right back all the way up to even 3 years. But what we found, and to bring hope to the situation, is that if you can manage for 4 and 5 years, that bar actually flattened and it stayed flat. That means that we were able to deplete the seed bank of cheatgrass in these locations with 4 and 5 years of management or control, which shows us that we can get to that depletion zone. And what we did is we actually took soil cores at the very end of the study just to show what does this look like in terms of seed bank. And this is what we found when we germinated those different treatments. When you did 0 years, 1 year, 2 year, even 3 years of management, if you took soil from those areas, there was still a lot of seed that was viable within the soil in those sites. But when we got to 4 and 5 years, we were able to finally deplete the seed bank. So what does this tell you? It tells us that we need to set our targets on this time period, and that is really going to get us over the hump and able to get rid of cheatgrass for the long term. And I've been involved with some really exciting projects where we've been able to get to this point, and I'm going to talk about some tools that we now have to help us get there, and we don't have to go back every single year and do these types of treatments. So what we need to do, this kind of shows you full circle why depletion of the seed bank isn't so important, especially when you talk about fine fuels and that fire risk. Because when you look at the left-hand side, this is an area that was treated for cheatgrass. And within about 2 years, you can see that that thatch, that fine fuel, is almost completely degraded by nature, really. And then your perennials are able to come back and reestablish. But on the right-hand side is non-treated. That seed bank, all those little seedlings coming back, you can see all of those within that area. And then even worse from that is the weeds coming back, but it keeps adding that thatch and that fine fuel, like you see that light colored fuel in the area on the right hand side of that photo shows you the wildfire risk of these sites. So what is really the key is depleting the seed bank, allowing our native perennials to come back and not letting the seedlings come back in and reestablish. So you may ask, you may have tried to manage cheatgrass, invasive annual grasses in the past, or maybe you haven't, but it's, in terms of tools that we've had, it's been very limited, really, in terms of tools that give us longevity. There are tools that you can go out every single year, but there are consequences with doing that, such as glyphosate or Roundup. It's highly effective on cheatgrass, but it's non-selective, meaning that it's going to control everything that's out there that it contacts. And so it's not really an option in a lot of situations, especially on our rangelands. Another option has been a Mazapic or Plateau. it's really been inconsistent from site to site. And I've seen, 90–95% of the time, it only gives us about a year control. And what I talked about and what you saw is that if you get 1 year of control, even 2–3 years of control, you're not going to gain the ground that you need until you get to that 4 and 5 year period. There's folks out there that do prescribed burns. There's nothing wrong with prescribed burns. You can actually use that for, sometimes a year of control of prescribed burns, but it's really costly actually. A lot of the counties in this area, it's $300 plus per acre to do some prescribed burns when you talk about the manpower needed to get out there. And sometimes, depending on the time of the burn, it can actually stimulate, like that photo shows on the bottom right, which looks like a golf course. It was a rain event happened about a week after a prescribed burn in September, and they just had a huge flush of cheatgrass, and it basically looked worse than if they didn't do the prescribed burn in terms of the invasion. So it can also help, stimulate invasive grasses. Grazing, there's an option to graze these, but it's very limited in the spring. When those invasive annual grasses are green, they can have some pretty high quality protein, but it's very inconsistent. It's hard to manage in an operation, knowing what pastures are going to germinate when, and it dries out very quickly. And so that window for grazing is very short when you talk about invasive grasses like cheatgrass. So what do we really need to gain ground on these species and then ultimately reduce that wildfire risk? What we need is tools that provide multiple years of control, right? We need to get to that 4 and 5 year period. We need consistent tools. We need ones that have residual, that are going to work in different locations, different moisture regimes, and they're going to give us consistent results. We need tools that are safe on our desirables, because if we're going to be injuring our perennials as well, we're going to see a lot of non-target issues there. So we want to make sure we're saving our perennials and getting rid of the cheatgrass and invasive annuals. And we want things that stay on target, right? Safe products, safe tools. So lucky for you guys, we it's actually been in the works for a long time, but the first studies were at CSU in 2010. So there was quite a few different researchers looking at this new tool called Rejuvra. And the first study was in Rifle, Colorado in 2010, and then it greatly expanded into all the Western US. And the search was for a tool that gave us, like I said, multi-year control with a single application. And this is one of the field days, if you were involved with this, the CSU field day, this was about 4 years ago. But again, it's been a very highly collaborative project, and I'll talk about that in more detail. The exciting thing is we actually got the grazing label in 2020. So we got the full grazing label. You can use it on graze sites with no restriction to grazing. And what's cool is this tool is going to really allow us to gain ground. I've been involved with some really exciting projects now. Now that we have the grazing label, it really expands the use and opportunity for other folks to get their hands on this tool. In terms of where we looked at this, like I said, the first studies were in Colorado. And then from that, we wanted to say, okay, we don't want to just, there's not just this issue in Colorado. We need to see, does this tool work all throughout the West? So we had over 130 replicated field trials. I think we probably have 150 at this point. We've worked with 18 universities, a ton of faculty and students, many agencies, government groups, counties, cities, including Douglas County. And it's been really exciting to be a part of this project in terms of collaboration, because like I said, invasive annual grass is wildfire. It's a landscape scale issue, cross boundary issue, something that I've been really blessed to be a part of. I just wanted to show you this, one of the few graphs I will show you. It really gives you an idea of all the level of control that we are seeing with this tool. Like I mentioned, plateau, it was really the only standard that we had in terms of invasive annual grasses in the past. But the issue was, like this photo shows, just one application. This is the 4th year after that first application. That plateau control after 4 summers is basically back to zero. We got zero control, like that graph showed. If you don't get up to 4 years of control, we're just not going to gain ground. What's exciting is Rejuvra, you apply one time and you can get up to 4 years of control with just one application. And that's what this shows across all those universities on the left-hand side, where we got 90+% control 4th summer after treatment, which is really exciting in terms of gaining ground on these invasive annual grasses. And how does this work? How does this tool work? We talked about something that we need safety on desirables. It's a seedling inhibitor. It stays in the top inch of the soil, and it doesn't control anything with the perennial root. So perennial grasses, shrubs, forbs that have roots below that inch of soil where that herbicide is active, it's going to selectively take out the cheatgrass, like that photo shows on the left-hand side. The cheatgrass is intermixed. When we treat on the right-hand side, we can selectively take out the invasive annual and leave our perennial, just based on how the herbicide works as a seedling inhibitor and stays in the top soil profile. It doesn't degrade by sunlight, which is also a benefit. So it can sit on the soil for up to 2 months without any moisture, and it's not going to degrade like a lot of other tools can if they sit out in our arid ecosystems. All right, so let's switch gears now to benefits of fine fuel management. This is where it gets exciting. I'm going to show you some operational work that we've done and what does this mean in terms of fine fuel management in this workshop in general. Why am I talking about this and how does it relate to wildfire prevention? I've wanted to show you this photo because I think it really illustrates what what's the strengths of tools that can give us that selectivity of controlling the invasive annual and promoting our perennial. So this is an area that was before treatment. This is over in Wiggins, Colorado, and I'm going to flip to after treatment. When we can selectively take out the cheatgrass, get multiple years of control, you can just visually see how much healthier those ecosystems are. You can imagine if a lightning strike occurred, it'd be more, that the fire may not even occur. It may not spread through that area, but if a wildfire strike, a lightning strike occurred on that left-hand side, you can be pretty sure that it's going to carry through that system. So it's going to, if we can get rid of that cheatgrass, it's really going to help in terms of wildfire prevention. I'm going to expand on that as well. So when we deplete the invasive grass seed bank and reduce fine fuel accumulation, what are the benefits? And I'm going to talk about a few of those. I can't talk in detail on a lot of these, but I'm going to focus on fire here at the end. But one of the cool things that we've found, and I'm not going to talk a lot about it, is we can actually increase pollinator and wildlife habitat significantly when we get rid of cheatgrass. And we have published studies now with CSU showing that if you can get rid of cheatgrass, you actually get more flowers per plant because those plants are healthier, they have more moisture, more nutrients, which means more pollinator habitat in those areas. We see the same exact thing with wildlife habitat. You wouldn't think that invasive little small cheatgrass annual plant's going to take a lot from a bitterbrush or Mount mahogany plant, but what we're finding is that you can almost double the leader growth of those, which is the new leader growth of shrub species, if you can get rid of the cheatgrass. And this is just within a single year after treatment. You can see for rabbit brush, bitterbrush, all these different shrub species, if you can get rid of the cheatgrass, you get much longer growth of those leaders, that new growth of the shrubs, which is the critical overwintering habitat for species like mule deer in the wintertime. So this is a significant player when you talk about wildlife habitat improvement projects. The other exciting thing, and I'm not going to talk much about this, but if you are battling other, let's say, noxious broadleaf weeds like, diffuse knapweed, like you see on the left-hand side, common mullein, those can also carry fires significantly. And, hopefully you'll take away what I said about seed bank management. And these broadleaf weeds, a lot of times will come back from seed. And so what we do need to think about, and this photo shows that if you can do a strong broadleaf herbicide mix for noxious broadleaf weeds, and then add in a tool like Rejuvera where you can manage the seed bank of those species, you're going to really prolong the level of control of those types of treatments as well. So that photo on the right shows you a combination of Rejuvera, Milestone, and Telar. So that's going to target the broadleaf weeds that are already up with the Milestone and Telar. And then Rejuvera is going to keep working on that seed bank of those species like knapweed, Dalmatian, thistles, and things like that. So that's just another aspect that I'm not going to talk a ton about, but that's something, if you're battling noxious weeds, this is something else to consider adding Rejuvera for extended control of other species, not just cheatgrass. So now let's switch gears. This is really what you guys are here for. Rejuvera, this shows you, this is the highway from Lyons over to Boulder, where they did some fuel break, fire break scenarios. And this shows you right up to that fence line where they did Rejuvera treatments. They wanted to mitigate that risk of fires running from the highway onto their properties. And you can see that by strategically placing a lot of these treatments, selectively taking out the cheatgrass, you can really help protect your borders and do strategic fine fuel breaks within these areas. And I'm going to show you quite a few more examples of this as well. Just clearly, these are operational treatments that have been conducted now that I've been involved with, and just shows you if you can selectively take out that cheatgrass, just look how much healthier those systems are. Look at what that fire break potential is. If something were to start on that left-hand side, it would stop at that line from a lot of the areas that we're seeing out there in the field. Here's another example. A lot of times you don't really know what perennials you have under a system until you get rid of that cheatgrass, and shows you how much that cheatgrass can exploit in that area, which shows you on the right hand side an area that was treated. That's over at Rabbit Mountain open space. But again, shows you how healthy these ecosystems can become when we, get rid of those invasive annual grasses. And all these photos, nothing was planted via seed. No seeding was involved. This is just all the perennials that were still on site, still intact within these systems. This was another example showing you how healthy, how we can use these areas as fire breaks, mitigate that wildfire risk by getting rid of that cheatgrass, because those areas on the right, it's going to stay green. I think this photo was mid-July. It's going to stay green much longer, especially in the peak wildfire season. This was up at Kurt Gowdy State Park, and it just shows you again this same exact thing. If a fire were to hit on the left, you can tell exactly what that wildfire would do. It would spread very quickly, very intensively. On the right-hand side, you have those perennials, those green grasses during wildfire season, really not going to carry that fire. Maybe mosaically burn, but it's not going to burn at the intensity that's going to burn out the root crowns of your desirable plants, like we talked about. This was a really cool one that we did over in Sterling, Colorado. This was one pass with a fixed wing, and it just shows you on that right-hand side what that treatment can do. A lot of times, you can see on the left where you don't really know what perennials are in there. There's actually a lot of things that are still holding on because we haven't had that, repeated wildfire like the Nevadas of the world have had, but we're getting more so like that. So we really need to be proactive and, like we talked about before, save the sites that have perennials like that right-hand side photo shows. This one's a little harder to distinguish, but this was in Pinedale, Wyoming. I think they were doing 10,000 acres last year in terms of some of their wildlife habitat improvement, fine fuel reduction treatments. And you can see the buffer that they used on this lake that they treated, and all the treatment area on the right, on the top. And what you notice is that that buffer strip is much browner. This was, I think, late July, and the top is still somewhat green, which in terms of wildfire reduction, fine fuel reduction, it was a very successful treatment, and they're continuing to expand on that project as well. What I wanted to show you, this was an interesting find that over the years of doing research with a tool like Rejuvera, it's given us that idea of if we can get rid of the cheatgrass for multiple years, what we find is that that thatch, the fine fuel on the left-hand side, actually degrades almost entirely by nature within about a year, which is pretty amazing to think that you could get 800 pounds per acre of thatch, that it just by minimizing those seedlings coming back and more inputs of that fuel to the ecosystem, you can actually degrade that to about, like we saw here, 40 pounds per acre in one of those quadrats 1 year after this is only 10 months after we had done the treatment. So this is in terms of it is an outcome that we can get to. We can get rid of that thatch. We can get rid of that fine fuel if we can just get past a year, 2 years control, and then that system can really take back over, and that risk of wildfire is going to be minimized. This is the same graph, kind of showing you the very similar results, where this was averaged over 180 different quadrats that we tested, and the biomass of the cheatgrass litter was right around 900 pounds per acre. And then that was before treatment, and we had very little perennial grass in those areas. But when we were able to treat, it actually flipped on its head. So 1 year after, we only had 96 pounds per acre of that fine fuel thatch, and we had 800 pounds of perennial grass. So it's shifting that system from a invasive annual grass dominated, fine fuel dominated system to that perennial, healthy, green, water, higher water content type ecosystem with those perennial grasses. So that's something that we really need to get to and target with these types of treatments. And like we've talked about multiple times, these invasive grass fueled wildfires have devastated many Western landscapes, and we got to be proactive. We got, these areas like Superior, these areas that, Cameron Peak, all these types of situations that we're starting to see more and more of. We need to be proactive in these areas that we manage, because this is what we don't want. We don't want these areas where we get so many fires. One high intensity fire has the opportunity to burn out the root crowns of definitely our shrubs, but our grasses, our shrubs, our trees, and completely devastate these areas. So we really got to be proactive in the way we manage. Okay, so let's go to the case studies that we've learned from the past few years in terms of the Calwood and the Cameron Peak. I think you guys will really enjoy this. Okay, in summer 2020, we had those two large wildfires like I just mentioned. But what was interesting is that before the wildfires, we've had several of these treatments that happen to be in these areas where the wildfires went through. And what this shows is some of the sites that I'm going to show you before and after the wildfire. But you can see clearly that line where we had treated, right? The right-hand side was treated. You see those perennial grasses. You see the space between plants, more bare ground. And then on the left-hand side is the non-treated. So that's that heavy cheatgrass, that high level of fine fuel, that blanket that's just going to tie together the entire system and increase the intensity and frequency of that wildfire. So what I'm going to now zoom to is a drone photo that I took. I guess one question: when the fire approached these previous cheatgrass treatments, how do you think the fire behaved? Just think to yourself, how do you think that fire behaved? If it was burning right towards this area, how do you think that fire would behave if it went? Would it go to the left? Would it go to the right? Would it be faster in certain areas, more intense? Would it not be more intense in certain areas? So I'm going to show you kind of how that played out. So this is kind of reorient yourself to almost that same, it is the same site that from the photo that I just showed you, but from a drone. And I took actually this drone shot. I didn't know the fire was going to come through this same exact area, but this was before the fire. So June of 2019. You can see the treatment on the right, non-treated on the left. So I'm now going to flip to after the fire came over that hillside on the top left corner, it burned right up to where we had that treatment line. And what we saw is that the treatment acted just like a fire break, which is what we wanted, right? That's what we are thinking more and more about. How can we strategically have these invasive annual grass treatments so that we can mitigate the risk of wildfires, especially in a case like this? And on the left-hand side, you remember we had all that cheatgrass, all that fine fuel, and you can see how intense that fire burned. But on the right-hand side, you had more space between plants. There was much less shrub mortality, and you can just see that there was some burning, but it was much more of a mosaic natural burn within the area that we did not have the cheatgrass. And this is just from another angle. You can see before the fire and after the fire and how hot that fire burned on that side that had the cheatgrass on the left versus the area on the right, which a lot of it did not burn. When you talk about shrub mortality and the heat intensity of the burns, you can just visually see on the left-hand side where we had the cheatgrass versus the right-hand side where we had done the treatment before the fire. And the shrub mortality, there was almost no shrub mortality in the areas that we had done the treatments, as opposed to these areas that we did not treat, where you had that fuel underneath the shrubs, which then resulted in a much more higher intensity within the burning of those shrubs. And a lot of the shrub mortality occurred in the areas where we had the cheatgrass. So again, utilizing the tools we have to minimize the risk of that fire burning through these sites and displacing those really key perennials that we have in these areas. This is this is just over the hill from where that happened. They had done 2 rejuva treatments on both sides of this other hillside that was not treated. And you can see exactly to the line where that fire burned so intensely. And it was the areas that had that non-treated cheatgrass. The areas that with the rejuva, the treatments of the, where we had some perennials, it did burn, but you can see that it was much less intense, much more mosaic. And that's what we want in a burn if it were to occur on our rangelands. And here's a more of a close-up of what that looks like on the left. You can see the intensity. You can see that we likely burned out the root crowns, maybe not all the perennials, but at least some of the perennials on that left versus that mosaic burn, which is much less intense. And you're going to have much more survival of our perennials in those areas. And I wanted to do this. I flew the drone up to give you just an aerial perspective. But what you notice is between those perennials on the right where we treated, there's bare ground between plants. And that's what we're talking about there. Where on the left, there's a complete carpet, complete monoculture within those areas of the perennials that's going to carry the fire, the intensity of the fire throughout the entire system. So that's what we're talking about in terms of how that carpet of fine fuel can carry a fire and how we need to mitigate that risk by getting rid of the cheatgrass or strategic treatments to break up the landscape so we can protect areas that we really want to protect. Okay, I want to show you another example. This was up in Sublette County, Wyoming. This was a collaborative project that we had with Dr. Paul Myman, Julie Kraft up in Pinedale, Wyoming with Sublette County, Wyoming Game and Fish, a lot of different folks involved. But what I want to show you is we did these big 5-acre blocks of rejuva treatments on this hillside. And within that area, we had our 5-acre blocks surrounded by cheatgrass. So you can imagine there was 5-acre blocks that had more perennials in terms of the treatment, but it had perennial, it had the annual grasses surrounding these sites. What happened is a wildfire was initiated a mile away from where we did those treatment blocks, that wildfire carried across the landscape. And just think to yourself, how do you think that fire behaved as it approached those 5-acre blocks that we had treated before? They're greener, they have more perennials, they have space between plants. What we found is those areas, as that fire moved from left to right, and you can see where they put the fire out on the right-hand side, what happened is that we had these areas where we had the treatments and there was a much higher level of survivorship within those areas. The fire actually burned around those blocks that we had treated, which shows you if you were to divide the landscape and do complete treatments in terms of fuel breaks and fire prevention type treatments, we could have minimized the risk of that fire carrying across the landscape. So just again, a confirmation that invasive annual grasses pose a major threat to wildfires and the risk of wildfires in the West. This was actually from a satellite. It shows you basically darker green shows you greener vegetation. So that shows us that within those blocks, this is a confirmation that we had more perennials, and that's where that fire burned around because it didn't have that space or didn't have the cheatgrass that was intertwined between those perennials. It was a healthy ecosystem lacking the cheatgrass, which allowed us to use these as a fire break. So just another example that I wanted to share with you guys. And here's a photo of what that area that we had treated that survived the wildfire looked like. And you can imagine when you have these areas with space in between, that fire is just not going to carry through. And that's the most exciting thing about some of these findings is how can you utilize this in your day-to-day and what you're trying to manage to help protect you from wildfires. Okay. Here's a publication. We did this with the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network if you're interested in reading the whole thing about this, but this photo kind of tells it all. This would be what that non-treated looks like, how that fire carried through and why it burned around the blocks, because that's where we had the areas that were lacking the cheatgrass. Second year after the treatments, showing you that we can, once we get rid of the cheatgrass, that risk of wildfire greatly decreases. Okay, see how I'm doing on time here. So I'm going to wrap up here in a little bit. I want to go through quickly the city of Fort Collins. They also had the Cameron Peak wildfire come through, and I wanted to show you some of the learnings from that. They did some large treatments in 2019, and that was before the wildfire, obviously, especially during that 2020, very bad, severe cheatgrass year. This was what the untreated looked like before some of their treatments, and it just shows you that these forests are really slow to regenerate after that 2000 Bobcat Gulch fire. And we really need to mitigate the risk of these wildfires, right? Because this shows you that the recovery can be very, very slow in these areas where we get these wildfires. So that's just kind of an aside from what we'll see in terms of the treatments. But what they did is these Esplanade and Rejuva are the same active ingredient. So they did Rejuva plus Plateau treatments. And this is what it looked like before. You see that fine fuel kind of interlaced throughout. And then after, you see the perennials responding, you see that risk of wildfire decrease as you get rid of the cheatgrass. So that's just showing you before and after. Here's another great treatment. Along a lot of their paths, they went in and did, I think it was 20 foot on both sides of their paths for wildfire mitigation. And you can see how thick that cheatgrass was in the non-treated versus the area that they treated. You see that buffalo blue grama coming through, the shrubs, things like that. So it looked very successful treatment. Here again, another line, treated on the left, non-treated on the right. Selectively taking out the cheatgrass, promoting our perennials on that left-hand side is the key. Here's another treatment, non-treated, and just the health of that ecosystem. One more photo. Again, showing you the water content, that green color, that's really what we want to see in that July, August timeframe when the wildfire season is upon us. Really good response to the perennials. Okay, but what happened? The Cameron Peak wildfire came through October of 2020, and we had some pretty cool learnings from that. We had, these sites had 80-mile-an-hour winds, so some of the fire breaks didn't withstand the fire. The fire was able to jump through that, but some of the areas did survive. But it was a very high intensity burn and something that we really don't want to see in these sites because it can burn out the root crowns like we talked about of our desirable perennials. Interestingly, when we went out to look at this with City of Fort Collins, this was a sign that they had already put up there that was warning of wildfires, informing them about the Bobcat Gulch fire in 2000. And then there's that burn scar behind it talking about the wildfire in 2020, that Cameron Peak fire. So wildfire has been on everybody's mind, but more so now because it's really encroaching closer and closer to our cities and open space properties. What I wanted to show you here, this was right at the parking lot of that Bobcat Ridge area. They had done some fuel management treatments before the fire, and you can see how successful that was at using that as a fire break within those sites. So they were able to manage some of the vegetation before the fire came over some of those areas. And these historic type buildings are very important, especially in these types of situations. I wanted to show you this. This was a same exact place before and after treatment. You can see where they had done treatment. There were some surviving perennials where they did not do treatment. High intensity likely burned out a lot of those perennial root crowns. This is really cool. Like I said, they sprayed some of their paths about 20 feet on both sides. And this shows you one of the treatment areas where the right-hand side, it looked like the moon, right? It had cheatgrass, completely devastated with the fire, where they had done treatments beforehand. They were able to minimize the devastation of the wildfire and save some of the perennials that they had on that site. And here's just another angle looking the other direction. Once again, Esplanade is the same as Rejuvra, and they did a plateau combination there. So what are the key learnings of this? I hope you take away that, managing the seed bank is key if we're really going to get over the hump for the long term of getting rid of the cheatgrass. And what that does is it depletes the seed bank, obviously, gets rid of the plant, gets rid of that fine fuel, increases the success of our, perennials coming back. Minimizes the risk of those intense wildfires coming through and burning out our systems, which would eliminate all the perennials, which then would lead to reseeding being needed. So we got to really be proactive in these invasive annual grass type situations. And Rejuvra is a great opportunity to help you all manage that situation. We really need to be proactive, right? This is the worst case scenario. This is what, and I've seen it time and time again. As those fires happen, this can happen. So I just really recommend that, you think about how can you incorporate this idea, these types of things into, your day to day, whether you're, a rancher, a land manager. There's an opportunity I see to still save a lot of the sites that we have and being more proactive in the management that we're doing. And like I said, being proactive is the key. We want to target those transition zones because that's where we're going to have the most success. And that's really where we're going to mitigate that risk of wildfires as they become more problematic over the next 5, 10, 20 years. And like we've talked about, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, right? We really need to be proactive, and that prevention is where we need to be. Okay, I'm getting very close to time. So I am going to very quickly run through this. So range view is using now satellite imagery. So instead of having to go out in all your pastures, it can be pretty difficult and daunting to say, how do I know where I should begin treatments? How can I come up with a strategic plan for these fire breaks? Range view can be a cool solution. We actually launched this last year. And what's exciting is that, like we talked about, your most valuable tool is information. So if you know your land better, you're going to be able to manage to the goals that you want to manage to. You're going to be able to mitigate that risk within that area because you're going to know your land and where those hot spots are. And that's what RangeView can do. It uses satellite imagery. You can go to rangeview.bayer.us. You can create a free account and you can upload boundaries. You can draw your pastures. And once you get analysis for cheatgrass, it's going to show you where those hot spots are. And I'm going to show you what that looks like here in a second. So how it works, you identify pastures or identify infestations of that cheatgrass with in-depth satellite imagery. You can then plan how you're going to attack that issue in terms of, how many gallons of Rejuvra, where are you going to target it? You can apply to, obviously break the cycle of germination. This is going to give us 4 seasons of control. If you use RangeView, we actually give a 4-year guarantee on the treatment of Rejuvra, which is a win-win for everybody, right? You get a guarantee on the treatment. You're going to reduce that risk of wildfire. So it's a really cool opportunity. And then after treatment, it also is a way to show before and after how well did my treatment perform, which I think in the weed world is unheard of. A lot of these situations, we don't have a tool. We can go on the ground, boots on the ground, and do, data collection and see or visually see how we're doing. But from your computer, you can see how well you're doing from year to year before and after treatment. So this is what it happens. So you go into range view, you can draw in your pasture boundaries, your property boundaries, you submit it for analysis. It's $2.50 per acre to do the analysis. And then we will send you back a map showing you here where that cheatgrass, where those hot spots are. And then there's, I don't have time to really talk much about it, but there's prescriptions where you can decide where you want to treat. Happy to walk through that with anybody who wants to learn more about it, but you can go to rangeview.bayer.us to get more information on that. But I'm also happy to, if you want to reach out at any time, I can give you a rundown. Like I said, there's something really exciting about not only for the short term, a lot of tools, they'll give you that short-term control. This is for the long term. So you're going to get long-term 4-year guarantee on the treatment, as well as that post-treatment type monitoring approach. So you know how well that treatment performed. So that's all I have. I went through, it's like drinking from a fire hose. I know a lot of information. I get very excited about this type of stuff because I know what impact invasive annual grasses, how parasitic and devastating they can be to the western US, especially in Colorado. We have, in Douglas County, there are, properties where cheatgrass is prolific, but like we talked about, there's still a lot of perennials that are worth saving. They're in those transition zones, and we really got to be proactive. So there's my information. I'm out of Greeley. My email me anytime, give me a call. Happy to walk you through, help out with anything that we talked about today in terms of Rejuva, Range View. If you have other weed problems, need any other assistance, please feel free to reach out. But thank you for the opportunity, and hope you guys learned something today.